The birth of the Soviet Union in October 1917 did not play well in the United States. Soon after the Russian Revolution, the two countries were at odds. Although the United States and Soviet Union had fought together as allies in World War II, they fell back into mutual distrust after the war. Americans were concerned about the post-war expansion of Soviet rule in Eastern Europe and were fearful of communism taking over the world. Franklin Roosevelt saw the Soviets' actions to try to spread communism to other nations as a threat to the free world he envisioned. The Russians resented the American interventionist policies and their refusal to accept the USSR into the international community. This hostile atmosphere between the two nations immediately after World War II became known as the Cold War and pervaded many aspects of both American and Russian life for the next 2 decades. The Cold War was further fueled by the events during the 1950s and 60s, including the buildup of military arms and nuclear weapons, the war in Korea and the invasion of Vietnam, the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. With the launch on October 4, 1957 of Soviet Sputnik 1, the first ever man-made satellite placed into Earth's orbit, the Cold War had expanded into space. This launch took the American people by surprise and sparked the start of a fierce competition between the two nations. From about 1957 to 1975, this Cold War rivalry, dubbed the Space Race, focused mainly on attaining firsts in space exploration. Such explorations were seen as necessary for national security and were symbolic of technological and ideological superiority. The space race involved pioneering efforts by both countries to launch artificial satellites, suborbital and orbital human spaceflight around Earth, and piloted voyages to the Moon. Both the US and the Soviet Union had acquired advanced German rocket technology and personnel after Hitler's downfall. Wernher Von Braun, previously the technical director of Nazi Germany's missile program, became the lead rocket engineer in the US during 1950s and 1960s. At the same time, Sergei Korolev was the lead rocket engineer for the Soviet Union. After the launch of Sputnik 1, many Americans felt that the US lagged behind in the race and needed to regain their superiority. Just months after Sputnik 1, the Soviets made headlines again when they launched Sputnik 2 into Earth's orbit with a dog named Laika on board, prompting the American press to refer to the mission as Mutnik 1. After 2 failed attempts by the US to place a satellite into Earth's orbit, Americans believe that President Eisenhower failed to recognize the importance of space efforts. On January 31, 1958, the US satellite named Explorer 1 successfully entered Earth's orbit and gathered useful scientific data. The race was on. In July of that year, President Eisenhower announced the formation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, otherwise known as NASA, which was a federal agency devoted to space exploration. The space race sparked not only strong nationalist feelings, but also spurred unprecedented increases in spending on education and peer research. By 1959, both the US and Soviet Union had set their sights on being the first one to the Moon. After one failed attempt by NASA and one by the Soviets to send a satellite into lunar orbit, on September 4, 1959, the Soviets furthered their lead when their unmanned Luna 2 spacecraft crash-landed on the Moon's surface. Then 2 years after Sputnik, the Soviets' unmanned Luna 3 performed a flyby and photographed most of the Moon's far side. On the morning of April 12, 1961, Russian Yuri Gagarin prepared to launch into outer space in the Vostok 1 later that day. He became the first human to enter outer space. The US reaction was mostly positive, congratulating the Soviet Union for their astounding accomplishment. During this time, President John F. Kennedy gave his I Choose the Moon speech to announce his support for the NASA Apollo program and redefine the ultimate goal of America's space program from exploration to a manned moon landing.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Kennedy's justification for the moon race was both that it was vital to national security and that it would focus the nation's energies on new scientific and social fields. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson predicted that a piloted moon landing was far enough in the future that it was likely the United States could achieve it first. The Soviet Union was quietly aware that despite their early lead in the space race, they would never be able to land a man on the moon due to a lack of funding. Between 1961, when the Soviets launched the first human into space, and 1969, when NASA's Apollo 11 was launched, the Soviets gained several important victories, including the first dual-piloted flights, Vostok 3 and Vostok 4, in August 1962, the launch of not only the first woman but the first civilian into space in June 1963, the launch of the first multi-person spacecraft Voskhod 1 with 3 cosmonauts on board in October 1964, and the launch of 2 cosmonaut Vostok 2 mission during this time. During this time, the US also had many successes and firsts with the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs. The Apollo 8 mission in December 1968 marked an especially important turning point for the Americans, as it was the first manned spacecraft to leave Earth's orbit, successfully attain lunar orbit, and return safely home. But it was putting a man on the moon in 1969 that most captured the general public's attention. On July 20th, 1969, the Apollo 11 spacecraft landed the first humans on the lunar surface, Americans Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. Although the rivalry between the Soviets and the Americans continued after Apollo 11, the American moonwalk marked a symbolic ending to the space race. However, humankind's venture into space will continue, for man has always demonstrated a strong interest in exploration, and space is the ultimate frontier.